I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Several years ago, New York Times columnist Ross Douthat made a splash with his provocative book, Bad Religion: How We Became a Nation of Heretics. As the title implies, religion isn't vanishing in America. It's simply embracing heretical ideas, from the prosperity gospel to sanctifying sexual immorality to political idolatry. What Douthat wrote back then still applies now. Warren Cole Smith caught up with Douthat at the recent Touchstone conference. Here's Warren Cole Smith with Ross Douthat.
Ross, welcome to the program. You know, you wrote a book, it's been 12 years ago now?
Surely not. I think only 7.
7 years ago.
A mere 7.
A mere 7 years ago, Bad Religion, that just, it made a big splash when it landed, and it's made a big splash with me and the folks at the Colson Center since then. And I want to talk about that book a bit today, even though it is 7 years old. And I should have talked to you about it when it came out.
But it's more relevant now than ever.
Well, I'm going to make that observation, but
I'll disagree with it a little bit.
You beat me to it. But I want to start with why we're here. You and I are both here at Trinity International University in Chicago area, Deerfield, and Touchstone is having this conference on fight or flight, which is kind of a debate in some ways about the Benedict option and other options for Christians in the way we engage the culture. What are you going to tell the group?
I'm going to try and be optimistic, maybe. Just a tiny bit. I mean, I think the framing of fight and flight, both those options sound a little bit grim. You're either headed for the hills or you're strapping on your crusader's sword. And I'm going to first try and give a sketch that's probably similar to the sketch that's in the brilliant book that you were just kind enough to mention of how we got here, how, institutional Christianity in the U.S. has gotten weaker, and sort of what the religious landscape in America looks like today as opposed to the way it looked 50 or 60 years ago in an era of greater Christian strength, or greater institutional strength at least. So that'll be probably a chunk of the talk. But then I'm going to try and basically talk about what I think are opportunities for Christians and Christian churches in a culture where the hold of Christianity is weakened. And so that means sort of talking about some of the weaknesses and tensions within and contradictions within the less Christian parts of the culture, whether it be sort of the elite level, more secular and skeptical institutions, or the sort of world of, I guess you could call it, pantheistic quasi-Christianity, where a lot of Americans sort of get their religion. So I'm going to talk about the limits, I guess some of the limits of Christianity's rivals, and where Christians should sort of, find a certain optimism about the prospects for renewal.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, a level of confidence in the Christian worldview, in part because the questions that the Christian worldview can answer, other worldviews just simply can't. So it seems to me that would be one cause for optimism right there, is that as bad a shape as Christianity is in America, atheism and secularism is in some ways even in worse shape, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are a Christian, you sort of are obliged to believe that Christianity has some important answers that other worldviews don't.
But sometimes, even as a Christian, you find yourself shaking your head at your own team, so to speak?
Well, I mean, I think obviously Christians are fallible and, heir to the same kind of propensity for sin, and just the propensity for sort of strategic mistakes that anyone else is. And, the gates of hell may not prevail against the church, but it doesn't say anything about the church in New Jersey, right? The Presbyterian church in your local neighborhood doesn't have a guarantee that it will endure if its pastors make mistakes or are corrupt or make bad arguments. And I think, look, there are a bunch of there's a whole range of sort of sociological and intellectual challenges to Christianity that are persistent and real and don't always have easy answers. And, ranging everything from the sexual revolution to controversies over evolution and Darwinism and so on. The whole long list of challenges is real. But with that being said, I also think it's true that, the rival worldviews come with deep problems of their own, right? I think that there is a basic, as much as Christianity sort of, has endless debates about particular points within its worldview, I think there's a fundamental coherence to the Christian worldview that's often absent from the sort of mix of idealism and materialism, I guess you could say, that characterizes a lot of secular world pictures. And then when it comes to the world of sort of, post-Christian spirituality, I think it's less about incoherence per se and more about, well, on the one hand, there's a sort of sociological weakness of highly individualistic religion, right? Which is that it doesn't form communities, it doesn't form churches, it doesn't form the kind of ways of life in which people usually find flourishing and happiness when they're embedded. So that's the sociological weakness, but then there are also just sort of dangers. I used to work for The Atlantic magazine, and just about a year ago, The Atlantic did a big piece where it said, it's really interesting that even as Christian identification in the U.S. has diminished, and there's all this talk about the quote-unquote nuns, people with no religious affiliation, that's the big story of our times, but, oh, hey, the demand for Catholic exorcists is way up over the last 15 years, right? And if you take Christianity seriously, then that would make sense, right? You would sort of assume that a post-Christian spirituality would get people not just into sort of a lack of community place, but some darker. Yeah, there are dark spiritualities that Christianity has always sort of critiqued and opposed, and also sometimes tried to exercise. So it's weird to talk about the rise of exorcism as an opportunity for Christianity. Maybe that's not the right way to frame it, but I think it is a signifier of the ways in which, again, if Christianity is true, or to be as blunt as possible about it, if the name of Jesus Christ casts out demons, then, Christians shouldn't fear a demon-haunted world.
So to speak. Yeah, that's right. Back to an idea that you introduced earlier, Ross. You said you were going to bring hope. What are some of the specific suggestions?
A modest amount.
A modicum of hope. What are some of the specific suggestions that you're going to make to the group here?
I think you brought up the Benedict option, right, as one of the ideas sort of floating around this conference. And, I think Rod Dreher, who's a longtime friend, can sometimes be too pessimistic about the state of things. But I think you don't have to agree with his pessimism to see the basic insight of the Benedict option as an important one. You want to build up communities that are capable of transmitting the faith in a cultural context where people no longer take the faith for granted, right? Like that, I think that as a baseline for how to rebuild a Christian presence in the culture, it's an obvious place to start. But then sort of the step, you can think of it as part of the Benedict option or a step beyond the Benedict option, but the next key is figuring out, all right, how do you make those communities sort of maximally visible and attractive to people in a society that is more atomized, more hyper-individualized, where people are falling into depression and suicide in larger and larger numbers? How do you have your arc be something that people want to row their lifeboats towards? And also, how do you do it across lines of class? I mean, one of the big stories in American religion over the last couple generations is that the stereotype of sort of the secular elite and the pious working class no longer really exists. That sort of the practice of Christianity right now in America is strongest among the middle to upper middle class. It's obviously very weak among the upper elite, but then it's also weakened dramatically in working class life. And figuring out how you sort of look at the parts of the heartland overrun with opioid epidemics, or sort of landscapes like that as mission territory, I think is a really important thing for churches to think about that isn't part of some of the usual culture war debates and so on. It's how do you plant a church in in sort of communities that have been left behind by globalization? What does that look like, right? Like, those are questions. So those are a couple areas.
Yeah, and that was sort of the thesis, at least in part, one of the ideas in J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, right? I mean, he had personally religious upbringing. He was raised, by religious people, but in some ways they got disconnected from that religion. And one of the interesting ironies of that book, I don't know if it's an irony, but it's one of the interesting aspects of that book, is that, J.D. Vance escapes from all of that, and he goes off and gets an elite education and becomes a lawyer and writes this best-selling book, and he returns to the Christian faith,
right?
Kind of in the midst of all of that,
right? And the culture that he comes out of, it's not a culture now of, Richard Dawkins reading, atheist scoffers. It's a culture filled with people who still identify with some kind of Christian culture and still will show up in church occasionally. But the communal aspect of Christianity, and then I think inevitably with it, some of the sort of more serious moral and doctrinal aspects of Christianity has really fallen apart. And I don't think any American church, has a clear handle on the scope of this challenge or what to do about it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned, sort of this, Flannery O'Connor might call it a Christ-haunted, she called the South a Christ-haunted land. In some ways, that's kind of the way you're describing America. It's kind of Christ-haunted in a way, which reminds me of something we've been talking about around the Colson Center related to Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign, is that here's a guy, pro-abortion, pro-gay, progressive in every way, and yet he's wrapping a lot of his views in Christian language, I think in part because the idea of Christianity, at least the idea of Christianity, if not the actual practice of it, still has cultural currency in some ways.
Yeah, and I think my assumption is that Buttigieg, I think he was raised Catholic and has ended up Episcopalian, I imagine in part because of issues related to his own homosexuality, right? But I don't see...
Well, then the old joke about the Episcopal Church is that it will interfere neither with a man's religion nor his politics, right?
Right, but he represents, I think, in certain ways, admirable attempt to reground the egalitarian part of liberal politics in Christianity, which is ultimately, I think the challenge for secular liberalism, right, is that it has this intense commitment to sort of egalitarian ideas and ideas of sort of human rights and so on. It's intensely moralistic, but it doesn't have a clear theory of where you ground that. And then at the same time, the Democratic Party, the strange thing about the party is it's become much more secular.
Yeah.
But its most reliable voters are still African Americans and Hispanics, who are much more religious in many cases than the American average. And this is something I think religious conservatives who vote Republican sometimes miss, right? That there still is this intensely Christian part of the Democratic coalition, even if it isn't the part that sort of manifests in the Democratic elite. But it's just an interesting, the Democratic Party is as Christ-haunted as any other part of American life in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, except in some ways for social conservatives, the Christ-haunted aspect is sort of Casper the Friendly Ghost, and for the Democrats...
Well, for some Democrats, it is, there's sort of this for some liberals, there is this idea, that Christianity is something to be escaped, and that the Christianity of some Democrats is something that's, fine as long as it's, about sort of a religious gloss on civil rights, but is, toxic and dangerous if it extends beyond that.
Yeah.
You're listening to Warren Cole Smith's interview with New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. 2019 has been a good year for Breakpoint and the Colson Center. In addition to bringing you outstanding Christian thought leaders and newsmakers on the Breakpoint podcast, we've launched our new equipping video program, What Would You Say?, on YouTube, and our Breakpoint commentaries are reaching over 3.5 million readers and listeners online. As the calendar year-end approaches, we'd very much appreciate your support to help us meet our 2019 financial goal and to equip us to reach more Christians than ever before in 2020. Simply come to colsoncenter.org/November to make a donation. Thanks for your support. Now, let's return to Warren Cole Smith and Ross Douthat.
Ross, you said something in the first segment that I want to talk a little more about, and it also relates pretty directly to the ideas in your book, Bad Religion. You mentioned Richard Dawkins by name. He who must not be named, you named in the first segment.
Is Dawkins he who must not be named?
No, I'm sort of joking with you, but you mentioned that American culture is still very much concerned about religion, and interestingly enough, it's that the elite in American culture, they tend to not be religious, and because of other factors, there is an aspect of the American culture that have been left behind, in religion in some ways they've left religion behind as well. And you say it's that middle class, but you also say in your book that middle class of religionists, shall we say, They don't read Richard Dawkins, and they don't read encyclicals from the Vatican either. Yes, they're Christian-ish in their theology. You talk a good deal in the book, for example, about Joel Osteen and others.
Right.
And I mean, it is a distinctly Americanized and homogenized and syncretized sort of Christianity. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think one way to think about it is that if you went back 60 years or so and you said, well, which figures represent sort of the sort of popular religious center in American life? You might have picked a Catholic and a Protestant, Fulton Sheen and Billy Graham, right? Graham is sort of the classic evangelist, and Sheen is the classic pre-Vatican II bishop in his full regalia who's hosting a primetime show that is offering a kind of Christianity-infused sort of everyday morality and wisdom.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've watched some of those old Fulton Sheen videos, and it is remarkable because you're right. I mean, he's in his full regalia, his full clerical regalia. And he's not pandering to his audience either. He's given some pretty rich doctrine and theology in a lot of his talks, and he was one of the most popular figures on television.
Right, he was Dr. Phil.
Yeah.
I mean, that's maybe that's an exaggeration, but then Graham too. Graham's not a heavy duty theologian, but Graham is offering a gospel that is, on the one hand, incredibly sort of open and in certain ways ecumenical, calling all men and women to Jesus, but at the same time, it's shot through with themes of, sin, hell, the risk of damnation, and so on. And then if you flash forward to our era, and this is sort of the change that I wrote about in the book, the center is, it sort of runs from Oprah Winfrey on the left to Joel Osteen on the right, you could say. I mean, Osteen is more of a red state figure. Oprah's more of a blue state figure. They're both religious in certain ways. Oprah would probably call herself a Christian. Osteen certainly would. But their theology has thinned out dramatically relative to Graham and Sheen. They're much more concerned, on the one hand, with a sort of therapeutic form of religion where Christianity is supposed to make you feel good in the here and now in this world, and a material side of things. Osteen, there's a sort of tinge of prosperity preaching to Osteen. There's a tinge of prosperity preaching, especially in her early days when she was, you get a car and you get a car and you get a car, right? That's diminished as Oprah's become a little less of that with time. But they both, I think that's sort of where the American spiritual center sits, and they're both Christian-ish. They're both, I think it's reasonable to describe them both as Christian heretics, not as a sort of pejorative, but as a, this is what they are. They're connected to the Christian theological tradition, but they've strayed further from its central streams and sort of wiped away some of its, its paradoxes. Christianity is all about holding complicated ideas in tension, right? And there's a blithe simplicity to the spirituality of an Osteen where it's just, no, God wants you to be happy, and that's really all there is to it. And if you're not happy, you're probably just not praying hard enough, which is not, I think, it's not the real Christian tradition, even though it owes something to it.
Yeah, you say early in Bad Religion that religion has been a durable idea in American politics from the very beginning. I mean, really from the very the settling of the North American continent, really. So not just 200 to 250, but really 400 years. Today we have a secular left that says religion is bad, and a theocratic right that says we were some form of a Christian nation, or we need to be fighting for restoring a Christian nation. And then you say, though, that the problem isn't that America has too much or too little religion, but the problem is that we have a bad religion. The slow motion collapse of traditional Christianity and the rise of a variety of destructive pseudo-Christianities in its place. That's sort of a summary of what you just said, right?
Yeah, that's the stronger way of putting it. I was being more,
Politic,
and moderate, but when you're in the book itself, I think that's probably in the introduction. In the introduction, you're trying to sort of set it out in the starkest possible terms. But no, I think that is the core argument, right? It's that ultimately Graham and Sheen are closer to the truth about human existence than Oprah and Osteen, and therefore a society that has figures who come out of those deeper Christian traditions at its center will be in better shape than a society that has this sort of Christian-ish therapeutic spirituality. And the book, I wrote the book 7 years ago, and I think portions of it, have played out on both the left and the right in the time since. I mean, I think a lot of shifts in American culture just over the last 7 or 8 years, the continued decline of marriage, the decline of the birth rate, the rise of sort of deaths of despair and suicide and teen depression and so on. All of those, I think, they represent a lot of different things, but one of them, I think, is the insufficiency of the kind of religion that predominates in the U.S. And it's not... Well, so I guess I would say this. Every author changes his mind a little bit in 7 years. And I think the one thing that is true now that maybe wasn't as true when I was writing is that it's easier to see a sort of fully post-Christian landscape at the edges of our national life, right? So I do still think it's true that basically we're a Christ-haunted country, and basically liberal politics and conservative politics are both informed by Christian ideas. But if you go out to, the alt-right and portions of the social justice left, I think you get far away enough from Christianity that you begin where instead of heresy, just saying it's post-Christian makes a little more sense. And, you see this in sort of, the sort of nationalism and white identity politics of some conservatives, and you see it among some secular progressives too, that at a certain point the link to historic Christianity just thins out to a point where it doesn't make sense to emphasize it anymore.
Well, we've been talking about the book, Bad Religion, and you, as you said, you wrote the book in 2012. That was long enough to see George W. Bush in sort of his version of Christianity. It was kind of the compassionate conservatism kind of Christianity, give way to Barack Obama, who became he was viewed by many as kind of a messiah figure. So there was a veneer of religiosity that was, or a mantle of religiosity that was placed on him by the people who loved him. And then 2010 comes along, and the Tea Party movement sort of rises up, this populist rebellion. Now fast forward to 2016, which was after your book. Locate what happened in 2016 in that timeline that you were able to outline. You were able to lay out pretty reliably up until 2012, but what's happened since?
Part of what happens on the right is a lot of people said when Donald Trump was on his, marching through the Republican primaries, how can a party dominated by religious conservatives possibly vote for this, hedonistic playboy from New York who had never evinced much religious interest in his life? And one answer is that religious conservatives, this is sort of the obvious answer, is that religious conservatives felt much more besieged by 2016 than they had even when I was writing the book, that they felt like a sort of aggressively anti-Christian, or at least anti-conservative Christian liberalism was on the march, and they needed, a protector, basically. And it didn't matter if their protector was a little pagan, that was okay because he fought. He was tough.
He brings a knife to a gunfight.
He brings a knife to a gunfight. That's right.
Or a gun
Chicago,
to
a gun to a
knife fight.
Yeah, this is Chicago, right? So, but then I think another part of the story is that Trump was actually really good at tapping into a couple of what I would call the sort of more right-wing heresies that I talk about in my book. On the one hand, sort of, a kind of Christian nationalism that does say, well, America's a Christian nation and God is choosing Trump, the people who write the Trump prophecies and books like that. And then also prosperity theology, because one thing that's interesting about Trump is that while I don't think he ever particularly went to church in his adult life, he did have a boyhood connection to Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York, the sort of power of positive thinking. And you can see Trump in certain ways as, Norman Vincent Peale without the God and with, a little more sort of ruthless capitalism. And that's, if you look at the core religious figures who are around Trump, Paula White, these kind of people, they tend to come out of that world. So in that sense, it wasn't just that Trump was playing on conservative Christian fears. He was also, he sort of leaned into these real nationalist and prosperity theology tendencies on the American right, and that helped him win, and it's helped him sort of maintain a strong religious base of support despite being who he is.
Yeah. Ross, I'm going to test out a theory on you that I actually got from your book, and I'm just wondering, what you think about this, how badly I've done violence to your book with my theory. Because, a lot of Christian conservatives compare Trump to King Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar or even David, that these are men that God used even though they had feet of clay, shall we say. You introduce a figure in your book. You don't spend a lot of time talking about him, but you mention him a little bit, and that is John Brown. And I'm just going to read one particular sentence. And this is, in a section in which you talk about, America's flirtations with Christianity has been a flirtation with all stripes of Christianity over the years. And then you say this: think of self-appointed prophets like John Brown, violent and half mad, but also visionary in his absolutist condemnation of chattel slavery. And when I read that, again, as I was preparing for this interview, I was like, that's kind of Donald Trump in a way, right? I mean, he's half mad to a lot of people, but he is absolutist on a few issues that Christian conservatives care about, and they're willing to overlook the madness, the sort of the soul madness of the man. Is that a fair comparison at all?
It's a bold comparison. I guess my doubt about that is that I think the Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar comparisons are more plausible, because I think the reality with Brown was that he believed it absolutely, right? He believed, that slavery was an abomination that God wanted wiped out, and he was willing.
And you don't think Trump really believes? He's just a populist.
I think Trump does believe some things. I think his views on trade, for instance, I think he's held for his entire adult life. The view that America is getting screwed over, pardon my language, by people around the world, that Trump believes absolutely. I think on the issues that matter most to religious conservatives, abortion above all, his views are just transactional. This is what I needed to do. This is, you can hear it in his language. He says, the evangelicals, they love me. Like it's a deal. He made a deal. And that, I think there's a political case for making those kind of deals. I don't think it's crazy to say that sometimes you have to support, a flawed or unchristian guy to get certain things done. But
right.
I don't think you're supporting someone who is deeply, passionately sincere on the life issue. I think you're supporting someone who has made a calculated move on that issue in order to retain conservative support.
Well, how long will Trump maintain conservative support, especially religious conservative support, if he doesn't honor his agreements? He's honored his agreement in some ways on the judiciary. But in part he was able to do that because Mitch McConnell and others who social conservatives often hate, right, was able to stand against Barack Obama in the last couple of years of the Obama. I mean, there were more vacancies whenever Trump took office than at any time in recent history. But Planned Parenthood is going to get more federal, despite a couple of Title 10 cuts. The reality is that Planned Parenthood is going to get more money from the federal government this year than at any year in history. He did not build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it. He did not repeal Obamacare. At what point does he not get a pass on not fulfilling these campaign promises? Is that
I
too hard to
think
predict?
the centrality of judges and the Supreme Court to so many of our debates means that his delivery on that issue has made a lot of religious conservatives feel like, that's the vital
few
the
and
vital
everything
thing.
else.
Now, I mean, with this caveat, I don't have incredible confidence that Brett Kavanaugh wants to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? We have a couple abortion cases before the court this term. I think it'll be very interesting to see how Kavanaugh rules. You could imagine, I think, a world in which if Kavanaugh ends up seen as, somewhere between Anthony Kennedy and how some conservatives view John Roberts, then maybe that chips away a bit. And I think, as we're recording this interview, I think a sort of unexpected danger for Trump is his decision to effectively remove U.S. protection for Kurdish militias, which a lot of evangelical Christians have been very focused on. They're sort of skeptical of foreign interventions writ large, but they're very focused on Middle Eastern Christians. They're very pro-Kurd, and that has attracted more rebukes for Trump from Franklin Graham, Robertson, Tony Perkins, than pretty much anything he's done, including, I think, some of his more cruel policies on the border. So that, I mean, to me, that was a frankly crazy thing for Trump to do, facing impeachment. But even with that said, my sense is that, people there were a lot of religious conservatives who opposed Trump in the primary campaign, and some of whom who were even really skeptical and maybe didn't vote for him in the general election, who, because we live in such a partisan environment, have decided, that you join the side you're on, right? He's our guy. The Democrats want to take him down. We can't let them win. That's such an important part of politics on both sides. You saw it with the Democrats under Clinton. Democrats would have been way better off letting Al Gore become president in 1998. But they were like, we can't let Ken Starr win. We can't let the evangelicals win. And I think that's where a lot of Trump supporters are now. So even if he survives impeachment and is up against Elizabeth Warren, I think it would take something bigger than just more funding for Planned Parenthood to keep religious conservatives from turning out for him. That's how polarization works.
You've been listening to Warren Cole Smith and New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. Again, if you're able to support the work of Breakpoint and the Colson Center as we begin to wrap up our calendar year, please come to colsoncenter.org/November to make your donation. Thank you so much for your support, and thanks for listening to the Breakpoint podcast. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.